Lloyd mentioned during the announcements, this Thursday I'm going to be speaking with two other authors at Saugatuck Center for the Arts, and we're going to be talking about the writing process. Now, part of my writing process is at the desk where I write on the bookshelf. There are 3 books. One is a dictionary, the other is a thesaurus, and of course, that's pretty typical for writers. But the 3rd book that I have is a baby name book. These are the books that expected parents buy, that has all the names of all the babies and what the names mean. And I use that in my writing because I want the characters that I create to have symbolic names. So in my first novel, the main character's name is Vito. It means life, because he's a character seeking to have a full life. And there's another character, Gabriel. His name means messenger of God, because this character had an important message to share with Vito. Names are very, very important. Now, when I was a little boy, I hated my name. And it was just a name that was unusual. Nobody knew how to pronounce it, teachers and other people. It was just way too ethnic, and I just wanted a normal American name. So I said that when I turned 21, I was going to legally change my name. But when I was a young man and I was discerning for myself what was God's purpose and plan for my life, one of my very first spiritual teachers said to me, "Sal, you have been called by name. And what a name you've been given, Salvatore, Sapienza." And he said Salvatore meant salvation, and Sapienza meant wisdom. And he said, maybe God's purpose and plan for you is to bring salvation and wisdom. Wow. Well, after that, I couldn't change that name. But I had to live up to it, and I am trying to live up to it. Names are important. We see that in today's readings. All of us in this room have been called by name. We see that in the first reading that Lynn read for us. Samuel, whose name means heard of God, actually had a very difficult time not hearing God, but in his response. God literally says, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel hears it, but he thinks that it's coming from Eli. It takes him 3 times to understand that it's actually coming from God. And then in today's gospel, Jesus calls Philip and he calls Nathaniel. And this Sunday and next, the readings are about Jesus calling his apostles to follow him. And what's interesting about this gospel, it's the very first chapter of John's gospel. And if you remember last Sunday, it was the very first chapter of Mark's gospel, and it started when Jesus was 30. Both Mark and John begin their gospels not with Jesus as a baby, not with the little infant being born in the manger. They both begin their stories of Jesus with Jesus being 30 and starting his ministry. And I think for them, they're saying to us, it is not our physical birth that is the start of our story. The start of our story is when we hear God's call and we begin to follow. That's the beginning, the calling. That's where it begins for all of us. Now, someone who followed his calling certainly was Martin Luther King Jr. Now, he was not born with that name. His name was Michael King. And the name Michael means one who is like God. And his last name, of course, King, leader. He certainly lived up to that name. Now, he was given the name by his father as he grew older, Martin Luther, after the famous church reformer. And certainly he also lived up to that name, because he reformed and transformed our world. Now, when Martin Luther King first started to hear his call to ministry, he had a lot of doubts. And we saw that in the readings today. When you're first called, you sometimes go to a place of uncertainty. That's why Samuel needed to hear it 3 times before he got it. And it's why Nathaniel says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Really?" And it took him to understand that, oh, this really was the Messiah. Martin Luther King's doubts about ministry came from the fact that he said that he couldn't fully buy into the biblical stories being true. And he especially said that he had difficulty believing that Jesus rose from the dead physically, that he bodily came back to life. And so he doubted whether he was called to being a minister because he didn't believe literally in those stories. But when he was in college, one of Martin Luther King's college professors said, "Behind the legends and the myths of the Bible are many profound truths that one cannot escape." And Martin Luther King got it. That it didn't matter whether these were historically accurate or myths and legends. The point was that they reveal the truth. And he couldn't deny that truth and what it was calling him to do. He said, "My call to ministry was not miraculous or supernatural. On the contrary, it was an inner urge calling me to serve humanity." And that's what I have been speaking about the past several Sundays here. That inner urge, that inner voice of God that's within us, that's kind of nudging us to become more and more of who we were created to be. That's what John Shelby Spong was speaking about in the words of integration this morning. Is about when we live fully and love wastefully, we are expanded. And that's what I love about in today's gospel. Jesus says to Nathaniel, "Come and see, I'm going to show you even greater things." Because when we live our purpose, when we live God's plan for our lives become expanded. Now, Martin Luther King had a vision of what the world could be. And in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, he said that he had been to the mountaintop. And I told you before, in the Bible, symbolically, the mountain meant the place of higher consciousness. Martin Luther King had reached that place of higher consciousness. And he could see what the world could be. And he said from the mountaintop, he saw little black boys and girls holding hands with little white boys and girls. He saw what the world could be. Now, in his very last speech that he gave the day before he was assassinated, he said, "I may not get there with you, but I want you to know that we will get to the promised land." So he kind of had a sense that he wasn't going to get there with us, but he wanted to assure us that we would get there. The promised land comes from the Bible. God promised us that we would get to this place of freedom, this place of liberty and justice for all. Martin Luther King understood that. He answered that call and he worked towards that. But his story is just an inspiration for what all of us are really being called to do. When God says in the Bible, "I have called you by name, you are mine," he's speaking to you. God is saying, "I called you to live this dream that I have for your life. this plan or purpose that I have for your life? Are you willing to answer that call and to live that purpose? So again, I'm inviting you to ask yourself, what is that inner urge, that inner voice, that nudge kind of leading you to do? Martin Luther King said that life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? He said that was the most persistent nudge that you keep getting. What am I doing for others? Because when God calls us, whether it's Mary or Jesus or Samuel or Nathaniel or Martin Luther King or you, God's always calling us to be of service to one another. Now, how that looks in what you're going to do with your path and purpose, that's for you to discern in your alone time with God, and you're listening to that inner voice and where it's leading you. You may not know what it's going to look like yet. Now, I have a plaque up in my office at the retreat house. For those of you who have been there, you probably saw it. And it's a quote from Martin Luther King. And it says, "Faith is taking the first step, even if you can't see the entire staircase." And I really like that, because it's saying, I'm going to say yes to where God's leading me. And I'm going to take that first step. I can't see the whole staircase. I don't know where it's leading. But I know that if I take that first step in faith, that it's leading to this place of greatest good, not just for me, but for all of humanity. It's a place of what Jesus says in today's gospel, greater things. Come and see. Follow me. I will show you greater things. So, this week, let us listen to the inner voice, the inner urge, and let us take that first step in faith, knowing that where we're going is this amazing place. The front cover of our bulletin today says known and loved. And it comes from where in the Gospels Jesus lets us know that we are known and loved. In the Old Testament, God says, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you, and I loved you. You were known and loved before you took human form. And God says, I know the plans that I have for you. They're plans of fullness, not of harm, to give you a future and a hope. That's God's plan for our lives, plans of expansion, of greater things. So let's take that first step in faith. Namaste.